Welcome to the Kind Heartfulness Podcast, exploring the inner reaches of the heart and mind, brought to you by Rangchen Yeshe Gomde, Germany-Austria, and your host, Eric Solomon.
Welcome to another episode of the Kind Heartfulness Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Catherine Dalton. She is a translator from Tibetan into English. I think many of us, if not all of us, who are studying and practicing Buddhism are relying on a translator in one way or another to help us understand what either the teacher is saying, or if we're fortunate enough to have a teacher who speaks our native tongue, then there is a huge canon of ancient texts that we are using as a basis for our practice, and those were translated by someone or perhaps several people. So what's going on behind the curtain? How do all these incredible expressions of wisdom, compassion, and awareness manifest in a language like English? So one of my favorite translators is Dr. Catherine Dalton, and she serves as Choki Nyima Rinpoche's oral interpreter and works as an associate translator for the 84,000 project, translating the words of the Buddha. And she's also an assistant professor at Kathmandu University's Center for Buddhist Studies at the Rangchen Yeshe Institute in Nepal. And there she teaches at the Institute's master's program in translation, textual interpretation, and philology. She earned her doctorate in Buddhist Studies at UC Berkley in 2019 with a dissertation focused on Indian Buddhist Tantra. Catherine has been working as an oral translator and textual translator of Tibetan Buddhist teachings since the early 2000s. Since 2005, she's been a member of the Dharma Chakra Translation Committee under Choki Nyima Rinpoche's loving guidance. And Catherine earned her MA at Kathmandu University's Center for Buddhist Studies at the Rangchen Yeshe Institute, where she served for more than a decade as an oral interpreter for monastic philosophy instructors and taught Tibetan language and translation. So it's with great joy that today's episode is with Dr. Dalton, and we're going to get into the magic of translation. Catherine Dalton, welcome to the Kind Heartfulness Podcast. How are you today?
I'm good, Eric. Thank you.
We're in Austria right now. Catherine's been translating for Choki Nyima Rinpoche, and she's agreed to take a little bit of her normal rest time, put it aside for our podcast. So thank you very much, Catherine.
My pleasure.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit of how do you see the role of a translator in when you're doing, for example, translating Choki Nyima Rinpoche?
To me, I think really the role is to, as transparently as possible, convey what Rinpoche is saying. And that includes the words that he's speaking, that includes the tone of his speech. I think this is the case in general with translation, particularly oral interpreting. The feeling that comes with what Rinpoche is saying, and as faithfully and clearly as possible to just make it as if Rinpoche were speaking English in this case, to the best of my abilities. Yeah.
Well, that sounds very challenging.
It's not, yeah. I mean, I feel like in this case with Rinpoche, because I'm familiar with him, I've been Rinpoche's student for more than 20 years and have been translating for him for many of those. And also, so I'm familiar with with his way of teaching. So that makes a big difference. And in this case, particularly also, I feel like Rinpoche's blessings are a very large part of what makes that possible to the degree that it is actually for me.
Oh, well, that makes sense. So do you see, how do you see the function of translating from, many of the texts and language that develop around them, and then the way the teacher explains is kind of even in Tibetan isn't a common way always of speaking. And here you are translating presumably for modern audiences in urban environments. So how do you see that? What is the challenge there?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Rinpoche uses a lot of technical Buddhist vocabulary. And so I have ways that I've become familiar with or used to translating that vocabulary. A lot of those ways, depending on the context of the teaching or the topic of the teaching, a lot of those ways there have been a lot of translators before and they've done a really good job. And then I think like, great vocabulary, I just use that, So, in particular with Choki Nyima Rinpoche, when he's giving teachings on Dzogchen, Mahamudra teachings, mind teachings, I've told you this before, I think Eric Pema Khunsang's vocabulary is great. And he developed it over many years and is a serious practitioner in addition to being an amazing translator. And so then I feel like those words are really good words. That's also how I first received those teachings, was with that kind of vocabulary. So I feel kind of a comfort with that, and then just use those kind of terms. And when it comes to other Buddhist technical vocabulary, I think if Rinpoche is using a technical term, then I should use a technical term. And so it may be the case that for people who don't have familiarity with Buddhism, then some of the words that are being used, they don't know. But I feel like that's okay, because it's an invitation to learn on the side of the student, right? Certain words, for example, I use the Sanskrit like for Dharmakaya. I don't translate that. Some people do,
yes,
but I don't, because I think that anything that my feeling with that word is if I translate it in any particular way using English terms, I've seen like reality body, for example.
Yes.
And I feel like if I say that, then someone will have some idea of what reality means and what body means. And then they're just going to go with that idea and kind of, run with it in their mind. Whereas if they hear Dharmakaya, then they might feel like, oh, what does that mean? And it creates a little bit more space for inquiry and learning of what those words really convey in this specific context on behalf of the learner, on the part of the learner. So the listener. So I feel, that I do that, but I do also, if I'm just giving a public talk, sometimes I do slightly adapt actually the way that I would express something. It would be maybe slightly different than I might in a Dharma center context where people are more familiar with the terms. So not much, actually, very, very little, but ever so slightly maybe. I think, we're in a modern environment, but if we're studying Buddhism, then that's a responsibility to learn. And so there we go. We have to learn new words. We have to learn new concepts.
Well, I mean, presumably someone born in an agrarian culture such as Tibet before the Cultural Revolution also wouldn't be born instantly knowing what Dharmakaya meant. They would also have to learn what that is. And so I can say for myself, I found it really confusing when a lot of technical terms were translated into English, because, as you say, I had already an idea of what reality meant and body meant. Yeah. And so I find in general, it's just, for certain technical terms, it's been very helpful to just leave them in Tibetan or Sanskrit and then gradually get to understand what they mean.
Yeah, there's a balance, though, of course, because if you're just speaking Sanskrit, then you're not really translating into English, right? So, I think so as well. And of course, these kind of Dharma terms also for a Tibetan audience who's not educated in Buddhism, it's likewise, confounding.
Yes.
So it's not that, anyone who is learning this kind of material is learning new vocabulary, even if it's in their own native language, actually. So,
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, but how did you decide to become a translator?
I didn't decide. There was no decision. I was requested, actually. The very first time I translated was actually, I didn't even speak Tibetan that well at that time. It was at a Dharma center in the West, and one of Rinpoche's Khenpos it's a funny and long story how we met. But anyway, he happened to be a Khenpo from our monastery. I didn't know that. I went to this Dharma center, like not knowing, met him. His translator left and he said, "You will translate, please." And I said, I can't, and then I said, I don't know enough Tibetan. I'd only been studying for like not even 2 years at that point. And then, so he said, okay, we'll just have a Dharma discussion in English. And then at one point, someone asked a question and he just answered it in Tibetan instead of in English. And then I happened to understand that particular answer and everyone just looked at me. And so then I had to say what he said. And so we did that a little bit. But then later also in Rangchen Yeshe Institute, there was a need for there to be more translators for the Khenpo classes. And so it was like, can you do this? And I don't know. Let's find out. And then it turned out that I could. I was very much still learning at that time. So I'm still learning now, actually. So it's not like that process ended. But it wasn't a decision. It was just that kind of ended up in those situations and ended up being something that I could do and enjoy doing as well. So then.
Well, how did you end up in Nepal then in the first place?
Oh, that was...
At the Rangchen Yeshe Institute.
Yeah. that was... I ended up in Nepal living in a village when I was 18, actually, in Yomo, just teaching English as a volunteer. I had, since I was a child, had a wish to go to Asia, kind of generically, without any particular objective. And it was a Buddhist village, and spent some time in the monastery in pujas, and was kind of interested from that side. And then I took a course actually the following semester in college on Madhyamaka philosophy. And I'd never taken a class on Buddhism, and I'd never taken a class on philosophy. And so I didn't have any of the prerequisites, but the professor kindly allowed me to take that class anyway. And I was totally hooked. And so really I changed my major from Latin American studies to Buddhism, and, completely changed the course of my plans and studies and everything, and went back as a student to Nepal and India and Tibet. That's when I started to learn Tibetan a little bit. And actually I didn't learn it that well when I first started to learn, because I had just been in Ecuador and speaking Spanish, and that was more what I was focused on. And then I went to Tibet and was really annoyed that I couldn't talk to anyone. And so
what year was this about?
This was in 2000. And then I came back and spent some time with some nuns, actually, and was teaching English, living in a nunnery, but like learning Tibetan, just kind of chatting with them, and stayed a few months longer and continued to learn colloquial. So I actually learned colloquial Tibetan before I studied any Dharma language. But I was learning, with talking to nuns. So we did talk a little bit about Dharma and stuff like this, but it wasn't, I didn't learn the classical language until later, which for me, that worked out well, because that's my, I don't know. I think some people are more auditory, oral kind of language learners, and others are more textual language learners. And I tend towards the auditory or oral language learner. So for me, that was a good progression. And then I ended up, after I graduated in Nepal, and met Rinpoche, and then he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm just here briefly, and I'm soon going to India." Rinpoche asked why, and I said, to study Tibetan and Buddhism. Then he said, "Why would you go to India to do that? We have an institute right here, like in this monastery. Just stay here and do it." And I did. And then I stayed until 10 years later. Rinpoche kind of sent me away to do a PhD, but I stayed the whole time after that. So continued to study in Rangchen Yeshe, and started translating about a year after that or something like that, and teaching Tibetan, and continuing my studies.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's really great. So where did you get your PhD?
At UC Berkley.
I see.
Yeah.
And how do you think that is informing what you do?
That's very helpful for textual translation. I think it actually really hasn't had maybe any impact at all on my oral interpreting. But definitely for a textual translation in particular, I did my MA in Vajra Yeshe Institute, and then Rinpoche encouraged me to continue with the PhD. I work also for 84,000 as a textual translator, and particularly for those kind of texts, when 84,000 was first formed, There was a meeting in India in Beer in 2009, I think. And at that meeting, Rinpoche announced to like the whole, he didn't attend the conference, but he did a video address.
Yes.
It's really interesting, actually, because it was like that address kind of created this spark where the whole kind of vibe went from being like, can we translate the Kangir, to being like, we can translate the Kangir.
Yeah.
It was really like, in my mind, a turning point, actually, Rinpoche's address to the group. But anyway, during that, he also said like, oh, I have all these translators and they'll translate the tantras. And I just thought like, what? Like how, I can't. And so then when Rinpoche asked me to do a PhD, I thought, okay, well, I better pick a topic of study that would allow me to gain the skills that would let me do this thing that he promised people that I would do or be part of.
Yes.
And so that's been extremely helpful, like working with, I surprisingly found out that I'm into philological approach to studying text and like really comparing different versions of text and looking at the differences and, coming to understand kind of, I like history. So my approach to Buddhist studies as an academic is a very historical approach. I find that really fun and inspiring, watching the way that traditions changed and developed. My approach in general to Buddhism is as a practitioner. That's number one approach. But as a scholar of text and so on, then I'm interested in historical development and the way texts have been passed along historically, the way traditions have developed and changed. And so that kind of what I learned at Berkeley actually was really helpful in working on texts, particularly Kangir and Tengir texts, learning how to work with those kind of texts, or learning how to work with different, additions, recensions of the text and compare. And I actually like that. I find it intellectually stimulating and curious and fun. But yeah.
I just wanted to, because some of our listeners might not know what 84,000 is and Kangir and Tengir. If you could just take a moment to describe that, and then I'd like to come back to your work because I think there's something very interesting there. Sure.
So the Kangir are the translated words of the Buddha, which were translated from primarily Sanskrit into Tibetan, but there are some texts in the collection that were translated from other languages, Central Asian languages, Chinese, and so on, but mostly primarily from Sanskrit. And then the Tengir is the collection in Tibetan. It's the translated commentaries, Indian commentaries or Indic commentaries on those texts. And these were translated, there are 100 volumes of the Kangir, thick volumes, and 200 or so of the Tengir. And so it's a very large collection that's basically the Buddhist canon, basically in Tibet. And so the 84,000 project is a project that was developed to translate that canon, starting with the words of the Buddha. So
translate into English.
Into English, yes. These 100 volumes of text. And so I've been working on that, sometimes more, sometimes less over the past however many years since 2009. Choki Nyima Rinpoche has a translation group called Dharma Chakra, and I first started working on those projects as part of that translation group, and then now working more directly with 84,000 as a translator on these texts.
So now I'd like to hear more about this. Why the historical approach to thinking about texts and translating? Why that's so vital for you?
For me, I like it because even though the truths that we find in Buddhist texts are timeless truths, and the texts themselves appear in the world, and people pass them on, and people have handled them and translated them and copied them and passed them along and transmitted them. And so despite the fact that we could relate to the text in a particular way as Buddhist practitioners, and I do relate to them in that way, right, as like the timeless word of the Buddha, nonetheless, work with those texts, especially when translating them into English, understanding a little bit about the history of the way those collections have been passed down and the texts have been passed down is vital to being able to do the best possible translation, I think. For example, with the Kangir, we have two kind of lines, you could say. within which the Kangyur has been passed on. And when we're translating any text from the Kangyur, it's a requirement actually from 84,000 that we look at one recension from each of those lineages, textual lineages, because they're sometimes not identical. And that's because texts are passed down by people, and people copy down texts, and there's, the process of human interaction with a piece of writing is a process that does bring about certain kind of changes and so on. And so, yeah, for me, it's, I think, important to compare. Sometimes it's like there's a sentence in one text that you're reading just doesn't make any sense, and you really can't figure it out. And then you look at the other recension of the text, and then like, oh, it's just a tiny little spelling error. Like that's what they meant, for example, or whatever it is. There's just different ways where, circumstances in which it's really helpful to look at text in that way.
So, I guess then it begs the question, because words have different meanings at different points in time.
Also.
And also the understanding of certain texts as a whole, the sort of tradition of explanation of the text changes quite a bit over time.
Also.
And I think that sometimes when we're quite new in the Dharma, we think, oh, this is all figured out. It's almost like frozen in its maturation, and now I just have to understand it. Is that, how do we negotiate that, especially for those of us who are just reading in our own language something that's translated?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, when I'm approaching these texts from the Kangyur, they're Indian texts. So we have to think about a whole world view within which they developed, and also the time period of those texts. Like, you're right, the same word used in the 8th century might mean something different in the 12th century. Actually, it does. Yes. I can think of an instance of that, sometimes, not always, of course, but, and also the ways in which, the traditions have developed, ritual traditions, for example, in particular, they do develop. Mm-hmm. And so we do see some kind of differences. So when I approach a text, what I try usually to do is to think about how, when I'm translating a text, how did this text function in the time in which we first find it appearing in our world, right? And that's one approach. That's a totally valid. There's another approach that's like, I'm looking at this text, maybe it's an Indian text, but I'm understanding it through a commentary written by a 19th century Tibetan master, and that's how he understood it. And I will translate the root text in accordance with the way that this master, and that's fine. That's also totally valid and important, because these, that's really important. But as a translator, you just have to, I feel, say very transparently, this is what I'm doing.
Yes.
So I'm approaching this text as an 8th century text, for example, or I'm approaching this text as it's presented by this 19th century master. And two totally valid, important, precious, valuable uses of your time, important projects, but different.
Yes.
And then just to be kind of clear about that, I think is important. So on the one hand, I like looking at text historically because I think it's interesting to see development within the tradition and change and so on. But the other thing that I find like maybe more inspiring even, that stuff I find inspiring, the change aspect, because it means that people who are serious practitioners and who had realization are interacting with this material and presenting it in ways that exactly match with the people in their time and place. That's really inspiring to me, to think about how people who are receiving these teachings, developing realization themselves, are interacting with them. But the other thing that's so amazing to me is the unbelievable continuity over time of the content of these texts. Like for my PhD thesis, I was reading a text that, we find around early 9th century in India. And there were some times when I was just working on the translation, there were some verses in there that I just felt like I could have just heard Choki Nyima Rinpoche say that yesterday, because it's identical to the content of his teachings. And to me, that's so inspiring. I remember also we do this Ngakso Puja. We're going to do it in a few days here, right? Yes. This full day practice of purification. And I was reading a commentary written by a 9th century scholar.
Yes.
And in Tibetan, but like it was a Sanskrit text. And I came to a few verses and I thought, this sounds so familiar. Like, what is that? I feel so, I've heard this, I've said this. And I realized I recited those verses in the Ngakso. They're part of that puja. So that's like amazing, actually, that level of continuity. Yeah. Actually taking these precious texts and then just bring them into modern liturgical use is like super amazing. So that kind of continuity I find also, as a Buddhist, I find that's incredibly inspiring.
Yes. Our teachers didn't just make it all up.
Definitely not. Yeah. But somehow, like, because you know that there is change and development in a historical context, the aspect of that continuity of lineage, when it becomes so clear, even in a textual, I mean, we know, like, as a practitioner, I know with confidence that the lineage of realization is there, right? Yes. I see it in my teachers, so then it's clear. Yes. But then for me, also looking at textual evidence of that is like, I don't know, it's just fun. It's like nice. It's cool.
I'm actually sitting with Catherine getting goosebumps as she's talking about it, because I find it very, very inspiring what you're saying. And also reassuring. It's funny, right? I mean, not that I had any lack of doubt, but still, I mean, this is what Tugorjin said, Dingo Kensei said, when I was very young, but I believed them, but still there's a like, oh, can it really be like that? Yeah. And then you discover, it really is. There's a kind of continuity that's being preserved. In fact, the Chinese word, which escapes me for Tibet, basically translate to storehouse, Western storehouse.
Oh, yeah, I didn't ever think about
that. They knew
that,
sense, always knew that something very precious was being preserved.
There.
Yeah. And in fact, many texts were lost in their original Sanskrit and remain in Tibet.
Yeah, this is why the 84,000 Project is translating this Tibetan collection, because also it's like a clear canon, which actually we didn't have in India. Like there was no closed canon. It just didn't happen. Each monastery had its collection, etc. And then this more formal canonical structure did happen in Tibetan. It's true. A lot of those texts that we're translating from Tibetan we don't have the Sanskrit anymore. The ones where we do in that project, in 84,000, that Sanskrit is brought into the conversation. And oftentimes also a Chinese would be brought into the conversation if we have. Yeah, exactly. So that's, it's kind of a complex project, but the basic idea is to translate the Tibetan canon, and we use as the basis the Derge printing of that, just you have to have a starting point, right?
One. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. And that's a well preserved and well edited version of it.
So where do you think we are in the, every time Buddhism has come to a new culture, new people, however you want to say it, there's a process of translation and manifestation. Where do you think we are in that process in terms of coming into Western languages? I guess we'll take English because that's what you're translating into.
Yeah. I guess it's a process that's going to take it's going to take time, right? It always did. I think that the process of translation has come a long way over the years that has been happening in the West. Even the process of being able to like access, for example, dictionaries and so on. When I first started Tibetan, I had like a paper Chandra Das dictionary on my table in Kathmandu, and then now I'm teaching, in the MA program at Ranjung Yeshe Institute, the translations that we have a translation MA program about Tibetan translation that also I think didn't exist, those many years ago. But then there's all these kind of electronic resources. And then, these incredible dictionaries that have been compiled by like Eric Pemakunsang's, the Ranjung Yeshe dictionary is, it's incredible. It's incredible to have just like compiled making a dictionary is a big job. So we have access to so many resources, and there are different translators who use different vocabulary, which is, I think, is nice. So sometimes people feel like, there's this translator uses this kind of vocabulary, this one uses this vocabulary. I understand the value of having a more unified vocabulary and this kind of, but we don't have like a Dharma king to make those decisions these days like we had in the past in Tibet. But I do think
let me
there's
just
also...
stop you so that people understand. In the old days in Tibet, there would be this king who was such a great practitioner himself that he would just say, okay, this way of translating, I'm anointing, and then all the other translators would fall in line. But today, being more of a democratic society, we have the one reflection of that is we don't have that kind of...
Yeah. But there is a value also in that, in the sense that I think people are different, and some people like the way one translator translates, and other people like the way a different translator translates, and that's great. And for me also, I love actually listening to different translators. Usually when I'm listening to a Dharma talk and someone else is translating, I bring a notebook and take notes on the translator's vocabulary. Because I'm like, that's really good. Yeah. I should say that, you know? Yeah. Or I didn't think of that word that way. This is like really helpful. So I like that kind of, I think it's on the one hand it can be helpful having that kind of variety. And then for me, I use it as like a basket of fruits that I can like, oh, that was good. He said that so nicely. Her word was so perfect. I'll use that one.
Yeah, I can see that. I find that as a receiver of translation that in the beginning, I found it quite confusing. I also think that when I was starting, the differences between translators was also much greater than it is now. But but then once I became very clear in myself, after having studied and practiced for a little while, I was able to understand more of what was really being communicated. And then I could appreciate more. Oh, when they translate it that way, that's right. This meaning is a little bit more revealed.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I do still think for new students, it's a little bit overwhelming if you go from Dharma Center to Dharma Center, hear teachers being translated by different people.
Yeah.
But maybe confusion is part of how wisdom dawns.
I heard that somewhere. Yeah. And also I think it's thinking about just different translators and Dharma translation in particular. I think it's really important for Dharma translators also, from my perspective, to be practitioners. I think it's really important because it does actually change how you receive and pass on what you're saying, to at least try to embody that. I mean, for me, what I find so inspiring about my teachers is that they embody what they're saying, like every moment. And so much of the teaching is not even the words. It's actually just the embodiment that the teacher is bringing into the space. And that, of course, is like for teachers like Choki Nyima Rinpoche, but our Khenpos too, actually, like they really, really do embody the teachings that they're sharing with us. And so I learn a lot from that aspect. It also gives a little relief to the translator because it's like what's being conveyed by the teacher is not just their words. There's a lot that's happening, of course, in certain contexts, definitely, like it's happening directly between the teacher and the student. But in many contexts, it is actually happening in that way in most Dharma contexts. And so, first of all, that gives a little like relief for the translator, but it also means that I think as translators, we also have to, at the very least, like do our best to attempt to embody the teachings ourselves too, because it changes the way it's received. For me, I've just been so fortunate because Choki Nyima Rinpoche has these amazing translators from whom I listen, whose voices I listened to Rinpoche's teachings for so many years and from whom I learned so much. And they're all practitioners. Yeah. And that's, that makes a difference actually to how it hits. So.
Well, one thing, because we talked about Eric Pema earlier, it was really at the time that I started receiving teachings from True Origin, you had let's say it this way, there were some translators who clearly practiced more than others. I think that's less true now, but you would know better.
We're all trying, Eric. We're trying our best.
But let's just say it this way. What was so remarkable about Eric, or what really stood out, and many of us felt this way at the time, is that he it wasn't just that he was taking, Tugorjen literally said this, and I'm going to be a bridge and make it. He had some taste of what Rinpoche was expressing. And so his translation came out of this kind of atmosphere of Tugorjen and Eric Pema Kunsang in unison. And it was something quite remarkable at the time. I think there's now other translators who do it. Catherine?
No, for me, actually, Eric, I received, when I first met Choki Nyima Rinpoche, Eric was doing, translating was Rinpoche's primary translator.
That's
and
right.
So for me also just, receiving the teachings through his voice.
Yes.
And as you say, the kind of atmosphere of the teaching space with a teacher and a translator, I have, it really touched me so much, because for me, it was like receiving those teachings, the most, perfect, powerful, transformative teachings that I had ever heard. And it was like such a life transforming moments for me happened in that time. And it was Rinpoche's words, but it was through Eric's voice that I was hearing them at that time. Because I was still, I was learning Tibetan. And it was some years later, maybe 10 years ago in Gombe, California, one time I had to translate in front of Eric a whole seminar for the first time, which was like scary.
Yes.
And of course, he was very kind. He's very kind. But during the break one day, then Rinpoche got off the throne and was walking out, and he stopped to say something and was talking to Eric. And then he asked Eric to just translate what he had just said to, people. And so Eric did. And then I actually started crying because I hadn't heard it for so long. And it was like, that was the voice that I first connected to those most precious teachings with. And so there is something that we receive also in that interaction.
I really understand what you're saying. But also, Catherine's being a little bit humble here, because in that seminar, it's Eric formally passed the torch. He really was, of course, he really was very impressed with your translation and saw the potential of it to really be a benefit. And I think there's so many of us that are so grateful to you, and your efforts, I think, are bearing fruit. When we are at this seminar, there seems to be a lot of people who are understanding things they hadn't previously known. And Rinpoche is speaking in Tibetan, and they definitely don't know Tibetan. So thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure, actually. It's Rinpoche's blessings, I think, that make it all possible. Really, I really feel like that, actually, because some of what, I don't know, sometimes some of the things that happen, I feel like it wouldn't be possible without that. Rinpoche will talk for a really long time or just whatever it is. And I'm just like, that's not a norm. It's definitely Rinpoche's blessings, actually. I think, and for me, it's such a blessing, actually, to receive. I receive a lot of teachings because of having this responsibility. And so for me, that's really extremely precious and such a, I feel really grateful, actually.
Well, I'm really grateful you came on our podcast today, and I really hope you'll be a regular, frequent visitor to the Kind Heartfulness podcast. There's so many things I still feel we could explore, but I don't want to wear Catherine out because she has to translate for Rinpoche in a couple hours.
2 hours.
Yeah. So really, thank you so much for taking time out of your day at a very busy time where I'm sure you wouldn't mind having a rest. And we'll see you again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks for listening. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, we like to invite you to continue the journey into the heart of enlightened mind at gonde.eu.